Arone Huku Chik Mu. Arone Hukuchu, which is, of course, Burmese for Achtung.
Oh, do you reckon a Burmese person would know that if they heard you?
No. We've just insulted the whole of
Myanmar.
Myanmar. Yeah.
We'll
right.
start treating you like a
Well, there you go. It was Khmer last week, Burmese this week. We're trapped in one part of the world, it would seem. Well, welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. James is still writing his book on Sicily, so we're talking via the miracle of the internet. Though I suppose you're listening to us by the miracle of the internet, so let's just spread this miracle around, baby. Today, we're going to concentrate on emails. Stacks of them have arrived at wehaveways.podcast@gmail.com, and it really is great to hear that you're all enjoying your retirements so much. Okay, so this one came from a guy called Clive. Still loving the podcast, guys. Best history pod there is. Well, I mean, you know.
Thanks, Clive.
Now, Clive brings up the potential atomic Lancs, because we talked about the atomic Lancasters a while ago. I found this on an RAF forum, he says, a few years back when researching RAF Enstone while working nearby. The Wellingtons were apparently partnered by a secretive unit about which very little is known. The unit comprised 6 Avro Lancasters, which, in addition to being painted gloss black all over, had no squadron markings or serial numbers. They were kept away from the OTU and, unless flying, out of sight of all other personnel. They were heavily modified with their bomb doors removed, and there's no official record of them being at Enstone. It has been rumoured that they were being used for experiments in carrying the British atomic bomb, which was in an advanced stage of development. We don't know when this is, so I don't know how right that is. However, such was the secrecy surrounding the British development and its inevitable overshadowing by the atomic bombs dropped on Japan by the Americans, that until quite some time later, very few people knew of this country's involvement in such a programme. Keep up the great work, says Clive.
Yeah. Well, this is really, really interesting, and I'm absolutely certain that this was indeed the case. Because we know that the Lancasters can carry 10 tons, so that's a big tick. There's also form in having them kind of having bits removed and adapted to take unusual objects such as the upkeep, with the bouncing bomb. So there's form in all this. And of course, don't forget that although the procurement order went out for the V-bombers in, I think, 1947, something like that.
Yeah.
Britain only got the atomic bomb in 1948, I think it was.
Yeah.
Or is that right? Something like that? Or was it 1948? I think it was.
Yeah,
I think atomic bomb in 1948, something like
48,
that.
49, yeah.
Yeah. And so the first V-bombers, the Vulcan first flies in 1952. Over Manchester, and I think in sort of July or August 1942, and then performs at Farnborough at the very famous air show in that September. So it takes a little while. So there is a bit of a hiatus, and of course you're going to want to be able to test these things, aren't you? So to me, that all stands to reason. I mean,
it's all it's all properly cloak and dagger, isn't it? No serial numbers, no squadron markings. It's all proper cloak and dagger stuff, and gloss black. That's an interesting detail as well. I mean, that's to do with the flash or.
Yeah, I mean, gloss black. I'm not sure. Maybe you would expect it to be matte, wouldn't you? You think of the kind of the stealth bombers and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
But yeah, just really, really interesting period. And such a period of incredible rapid change. And what's interesting, the British felt very, very sort of shafted by the Americans, who were so good at doing coalition warfare. I mean, the effort they put into making sure everyone got on and everything, and that they worked together was just immense. But the moment the war's over, oh my God, okay, all right, that was then, this is now.
Although the door on the Manhattan Project starts closing, Churchill keeps trying to bring it up, and the Americans start closing the door on it. Really, by 1944, it's only going in one direction.
You've got a lot of British scientists involved in it. You've got a lot of British scientific technology involved in it. But you're absolutely right, because I was talking to you the other day about Leonard Cheshire. I mean, Leonard Cheshire was an observer on the second one, and only at the 10th hour was he finally allowed on. I mean, the Americans were all for kind of sort of cutting him out of the whole thing. So you're absolutely right. But the British, nonetheless, felt very kind of punched in the face on this one, and felt that hang on a minute, we were doing this together. What are you saying? And actually, some years ago, I did some work on the Cold War and this whole period and the development of jet power and everything, and it was fascinating to do, because one of the main reasons why the British wanted nuclear power was not because they feared the Soviets starting a Third World War. It was the Americans, because the Americans were using British bases, Second World War bomber bases, for their nuclear fleet, and the problem was that the fear was that the Americans might do send a nuclear warhead over to the Soviet Union, and then basically skedaddle back to the US, and they'd be fine, Jack. But we'd be left in the middle, and we'd be the one who'd be on the receiving end. So it was making sure that we had that clout at the top table, so that we had that armament and that capability as well. But it was fear of what the Americans might do was greater than fear of what the Soviets might do in those kind of early years, which I thought was just absolutely fascinating, something I hadn't considered at all before I kind of started looking into it. But amazing.
That is amazing.
Yeah, and it was also amazing finding about those V bombers, and what's absolutely incredible. I remember having a look at the original pencil sketch drawn up by the young Avro Tyros in the design department, and oh my god, I mean, you think the Vulcan that eventually emerged looked futuristic. The original sketch that they designed was just flipping off the radar. I mean, it was just unbelievable. And actually, when you look at the Victor and the Valiant, if you look at the Victor, I mean, just look at the cockpit of that. I mean, just imagine that first flies in something like 1954 or something, and just look how futuristic it is. I mean, just imagine if you had been in Britain in the early 1950s. You've still got shit cars. Everything looks a bit drab. There's lots of holes in the street where houses are being demolished and stuff. Everything's still looking a little bit drab. And then you've got these futuristic visions of silver streaks hurtling across the sky, big and bold and noisy. I mean, it must have just been incredible. Yeah.
Well, and especially as everything had been propeller aircraft up until then, and suddenly you've got this whole new technology completely.
Yeah.
It must have been mind-blowing, the arrival of the jet.
Absolutely. Absolutely,
right,
and particularly that these designs that are coming out, which are just so radical and so different and so completely kind of new and forward-looking. I mean, just amazing.
Right, we have another question from Andrew. Well, an email from Andrew Ogden. Dear guys, loving the show and the book recommendations. You've recently mentioned about the work of the Red Cross. Could I ask you to mention how the Red Cross saved the British populations of Guernsey and Jersey from starvation in late 1944? I wasn't aware of this until a recent holiday on the islands. When Operation Cobra swept down the Normandy Peninsula after D-Day, the German garrison British civilians on the island were cut off from their mainland food supply in August 1944. Since the Germans wouldn't surrender, the food stock started to run out and people were facing starvation. The Red Cross chartered the SS Vega, filled it with Red Cross food parcels, and starting in December 1944, made a total of 5 food runs into the islands before the end of the war. Garrison, of course, only surrendered on the 9th of May 1945. Great work by the Red Cross. I didn't know about that. I didn't realise the Red Cross had been able to top up the Channel Islands. I just did not know.
Yeah, I mean, the Channel Islands were absolutely starving. It really was kind of sort of, raw potato time. I mean, just it was brutal. It was absolutely brutal. And of course, they weren't actually liberated until after the liberation, if you sort of mean. So there was the ships came in, I think, not until late on the 8th or the 9th of May or something like that. So, they were really in it right till the very end. It was tough.
Yeah. Okay. Daniel Cross, moving on from the Red Cross, Daniel Cross says, Dear Alan James, I thoroughly enjoy the podcast. I'm particularly interested in the most recent episode about the British liberation of Belsen. My great uncle, Woe Wilson, was a pilot in 486 Squadron, New Zealand, and his Tempest was shot down near Bergen in 1945. He managed to land safely just behind Allied lines, but was badly burned. He was taken to Belsen within days of it being liberated, as the British Army had set up decent medical facilities there for obvious reasons. I'm sure you're only too aware of the events surrounding Belsen. Uncle Jim was obviously horrified by what he saw. He said that on the whole, the war was fun. He didn't really have a moral reason for fighting, especially in Europe. He implied that this attitude was reflected among many of the combatants. He never spoke in any detail about Belsen, aside from stating that he suddenly knew what he was fighting for. That's interesting. That's a common thing from the end of the war, is that the camps, everyone goes, oh God, right, this is what it's actually about. You mentioned in the podcast that British resolve towards the Germans changed after Belsen. With Uncle Jim, it all became unrelentingly clear. Uncle Jim went on to become one of Mackindow's guinea pigs and never fully recovered. A mural depicting him flying a Typhoon could be seen in the Wanaka Air Museum in New Zealand's South Island. Many thanks, Daniel Cross. What a fantastic email.
Yeah, amazing.
Fascinating.
Isn't it? Absolutely fascinating.
But that is the case, is that discovering the camps, you get this real ripple through it's 8th Army Group by that point, isn't it? Or 8 Corps, isn't it?
Yeah.
They're going, well, this is what we're here for. This is the point of the war.
Yeah. I'll tell you what, something's just occurring to me here. And that is that we're getting some really, really amazing stuff and stuff that you and I didn't know about. And, you know, it makes you realise that there's all these little stories out here, these little nuggets, which all add up to something a bit bigger, don't they?
Yeah.
And maybe we should start encouraging people to bring this in and put it in some kind of depository somehow. I don't know. We Have Ways archive or something. I don't know. I'm talking completely off the top of my head here.
No, I think that's a great idea.
But I think it's something, idea. You know, because otherwise they're going to get lost, aren't they? And you know, and it's sort of, my Uncle Bob told me this. But once the person he told it to is gone, it's gone, isn't it? And the longer you hold on to it, and it's just a verbal memory, the longer it starts to merge and become something else. I mean, there must be loads of people out there with kind of photos and stuff and ration cards and all sorts of bits and pieces. And you know, you don't want it to be lost, do you? And actually, people come up to me quite a lot and say, oh, you know what, you know, how do you, what should I do with X? And I always kind of say, well, you know, you should put it in, give it to one of the museums or stuff. But, you know, if you give it to the Imperial War Museum now, it's just going to end up in some box somewhere in Duxford. And I don't know, I just think there's something, we need to think about this.
We Have Ways Virtual Archive.
We Have Ways Virtual Archive that anyone in the world can access. What's not to like? Whether you be a scholar, whether you just be an interested party. There it all is.
Okay. Well, we're going to take a short break now while we figure out how to monetize that. We'll be back quicker than it takes General Gavin to say, let's not bother with that bridge. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. James is in his author's retreat. Isn't that right, James?
Yeah. It's great.
I mean, the thing is, you know, I'm picturing sort of kind of silk curtains and, you know, being brought a boiled egg in the morning and all that sort of thing. You know, like
no, nothing like that.
Real ale.
Like it's an old fisherman's cottage. It's got, you know, it's got stone flags, stone floors. It's just me and Betsy, my dog. Everyone else has been left at home. But I tell you what, I am absolutely caning it. I'm just getting through so many words. And the start of the book is always the most complicated because you've got to get your ducks in a row. You've got to organise your cast list. You've got to kind of do the backstory. And the backstory is, you know, if you're not careful, can be a bit boring because you want the whole thing to have a narrative drive and that read-on factor. So you've got to make it interesting. So it just, once you get into the meat of it, once they've all landed, and you know, the invasion's underway, it kind of sort of, it doesn't write itself, but you know what I mean? You're kind of into the swing of it. So
are you writing about the planning then now? Is that the...
I have been writing about, I've done the planning, so that's done, big tick. And it's, that in itself has been really, really interesting because I just think everyone's been really, really harsh on the Allies in the past. You know, about chaotic planning and all the rest of it.
Yeah, because you look at you read a standard kind of history of this. It's that, you know, the whole Sicily plan is chaotically put together, badly executed in lots of ways, and all the main players just really should have known better. Is the kind of tone you'll get, won't you?
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of sort of, aren't the Allies all a bit crap? Aren't the Germans amazing for what they did? And you know, I just sort of think, no. I think what's amazing about I mean, the plan that they do end up with ends up being the right plan. And one of the reasons why it's the right plan is because actually air power massively punches above its weight. and does a lot of and negates a lot of the problems they have. The big problem is you've got these airfields all over Sicily, and it's triangular, and you've got a whole batch in the west, you've got a batch in the sort of central southern bit, and you've got a bit in the you've got a load more in the east. So what the airmen and the naval men are worried about, the naval men are worried that Axis air power is going to kind of hamper the shipping bit of the invasion. And the airmen are also worried about that they're not going to be able to provide sufficient air cover if you leave all these air grounds intact. So there is a massive case for having a western landing in the western part of Sicily, but also a landing in the eastern part of Sicily. And all this debates and all these discussions are going on while the head of the army, of the ground forces, is also being kind of airlifted into Tunisia to sort out the kind of disaster that's unfolding following Kasserine and lick the whole thing into shape and make sure that we win in Tunisia, PDQ. And so poor old Alexander has got two jobs. He's got to oversee the planning for the next major invasion, which is going to be the largest amphibious invasion ever undertaken, ever in the history of the world. And that basically the last precedent for this is Gallipoli, because Torch doesn't count because they've already politically kind of worked out that the French are going to throw in the towel after a couple of days. So it's not the same. And as everyone knows, Gallipoli didn't go spectacularly well. So, there's a lot to kind of think about here, whilst at the same time kind of trying to reorganise the front in Tunisia and make sure that we win in quick order so that we can actually then get on with Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. So there are these debates. And the thing about the Western thing is, it's fine to separate your forces if the opposition is going to be really, really weak. But it's not fine to separate your forces and have a landing force in the West completely mutually unsupportive of what's happening in the East if the opposition is really strong. The problem is no one has the faintest idea at the time of planning what the strength of the Axis forces on Sicily is going to be. And so therefore it goes through a number of different planning stages, which is just entirely normal by current standards and absolutely fine. And frankly, is a miracle that they ever get to any kind of agreement by the beginning of May, which is still within the dates of the North Africa campaign. I mean, it's phenomenal. And what actually happens is they decide to concentrate on the East, which is clearly the most sensible thing, because the one thing that cannot happen is that it fails. I mean, that trumps everything. So you've got to be cautious, and you've got to make sure you've got all your bases covered. And how they get around the whole problem of the airfields in the West still being kind of up and running without a landing in the West is by absolutely hammering them with air power. And the air power performance in May and June and the first part of July is absolutely off the radar.
And the Luftwaffe is essentially defeated in the Mediterranean. But by the time of Husky, and in fact, and what they've been, and what the Germans have been doing is bringing air power over from the Eastern Front to try and resolve the battle in around Malta, and to try and have a decisive moment, and they can't do it, and the air power rate of attrition in the Med during this period is actually decisive on the Eastern Front because was when people go, the Med's a sideshow. Well, if you're the Luftwaffe, it isn't because
if you're Hitler, it isn't.
Yeah, and if you're Hitler, it isn't. But the Luftwaffe have been given the job of sorting out the Mediterranean, and because after all, they don't have the naval power to do that, but air power arguably can have an effect. And you look at the Malta battle at one point, the Axis air power is incredibly effective and does. Write down what the Allies are able to do in the Med. And so that's the Axis effort, the Luftwaffe effort, which means they can't do it on the Eastern Front at precisely the point they need to be doing it. And so when people go, Tunisia's a sideshow, the Med's a sideshow, Italy's a sideshow, it's nonsense, because the Luftwaffe is, the first major defeat inflicted on the Luftwaffe happens in the Med in 1943, and then the second one, of course, is Big Week in 1944.
I mean, they lose between November and the beginning of May 1942. The Luftwaffe loses something like 2,400 aircraft.
Yeah,
mostly in Tunisia. Between June and September 1943, the Luftwaffe loses 702 aircraft on the Eastern Front and 3,504 in the Mediterranean. I mean,
there we are.
That's just amazing. So they've lost 6,000 aircraft in 10 months in the Mediterranean.
Yeah, and it doesn't matter how many fighters you're able to squeeze out. You can't keep up with the aircrew. You can't keep up with the training.
That's the problem.
Yeah, and all that.
And it goes back to Mackie Steinhoff, whose extract from his book I was reading over Christmas. And he's saying, you have no idea what's going on. When Franzel Lutzog turns up and says, come on, surely you can pull your finger out a little bit here. And he goes, you just haven't got the first clue. We haven't got enough parts. We haven't got enough. The conditions here are just not conducive to kind of fighter warfare because, the engines are effectively being kind of sandpapered to death. You've got these new guys coming out who just... You're spending 90% of your time over water. It's just not the same. It's unbelievably dangerous, incredibly difficult circumstances.
And the American Air Force deployment in the Med is colossal by the point of Husky, isn't it? I mean, there's thousands of the American build up in the Med with aircraft is gigantic, isn't it? This thing that the Luftwaffe can try all it likes, but it just can't beat what's being put in front of it. And obviously this has a knock-on the Eastern Front because it means that they no longer control the control of the skies is the thing that made Barbarossa go so well to start with.
Yes.
And they've lost their grip on that. It's gone.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I think people very often when looking at the idea of the Med as a sideshow, they could leave the air side out of it completely. And the Allies are able
because it's because everyone's so land-centric. Everyone thinks in terms of the land power. And one of the reasons we think in terms of land power also is because, to a large extent, from kind of sort of middle of 1943 onwards, land power is all that the Germans have got left. I mean, not entirely. I mean, of course, there is still Luftwaffe, of course. But to a certain extent, that it's certainly got almost no naval power. And so predominantly Germany is fighting the last kind of sort of couple of years of the war on land, and of course predominantly in the Eastern Front the campaign is a land-based campaign, albeit augmented by air power, whereas the Allies are absolutely fighting on free planes. They're fighting naval power, air power and land power, and that is all part of their kind of steel not flesh strategy.
And in separate theatres. So what you've got is you've a Mediterranean theatre, and the air power there isn't going to have to suddenly go off, fly back to the UK and put out the brush fire. The Luftwaffe are like a fire brigade, and they're being sent all over because the Germans are as ever actually short-handed in every respect.
Yeah, so they're trying to use it as a kind of force multiplier, and it's not really working anymore.
Yeah. Okay, right. Well, that spun wildly off what we were going to talk about.
But
we have another. No, it doesn't matter, does it? No, I can't wait to read this book. When's it in all good bookshops, James?
September sometime.
Wonderful, fantastic. Okay, we have another email. James Dunn says, absolutely love the pod. Hi, chaps. Bit of a latecomer, but have binge listened to them all in a couple of weeks. God, you have my deepest sympathy. God, mate.
That's impressive.
Yeah, I mean, if you haven't been coherently brainwashed by us, then, Anyway, I have a question about the impact of Dunkirk. Obviously, rescuing 340,000 soldiers is a huge boost for morale, especially for those rescued. But what military impact did it have on the outcome of the war? If there had been no huge evacuation, would things have been different? Presumably, Germany still couldn't have invaded Britain. Not enough landing craft, no coherent plan, no air supremacy or naval supremacy. Unless you think the blow to morale would have seen Britain surrender, surely we'd have eventually rearmed and retrained troops, even if it took a little longer. So what other impact was there? Did the men rescued from Dunkirk go on to play a significant role elsewhere, e.g. in North Africa? Love to hear your thoughts on this. Thank you. Well, the evacuation's decisive in so many ways, isn't it? Because if nothing else, you got to get all your professional soldiers out, because what you're going to need to do one way or another is rebuild. And it's those cadres that are if I were to prioritise any one thing, it's getting the people out who are then able to rebuild the army. That's the amongst the 340,000 soldiers. Obviously, the other thing is if you'd left all those men in France, it gives the Germans a real powerful political football, a hostage, essentially. And we are, after all, talking about the Hitler government. So they're not. If they manage to capture an entire British army, they're not going to play nice with it, are they? That's I think a thing.
No, I think
as a bargaining chip.
I think on paper, yes, we should have been able to carry on, and it doesn't really, of course, it matters absolutely enormously, but because we're a naval power,
politically,
we would have been fine. Politically, we've been absolutely stuffed, and the closest Britain comes to losing the war, to my mind, without a shadow of doubt, is Monday the 27th of May, 1940. And that is just as Operation Dynamo is getting underway. It's actually launched, the green button is fired off at kind of 5:30 p.m. On the previous Sunday. But actually, the 27th is the first day of lifting troops, and they're incredibly pessimistic, and only 7,669 men are lifted on that day. And because of the pressure of the Germans, all the rest of it, because of the terrible situation of having to lift people off beaches, it is expected that the absolute best case scenario is about 40,000 men, which is obviously catastrophic. Now, the problem... So what happens is what you have to understand is that no one has forecast this. This is just the biggest total shock ever. And for the moment, the British people are panicking. They're like rabbits in headlights. They're just thinking, "Oh my God, this is absolutely catastrophic." This is why kind of Harold Nicholson and Vita Sackville West have got cyanide pills to take if the Germans arrive. They're just totally thrown. And Halifax, who is the Foreign Secretary, is the most respected politician in the country, is the one who's going, look, we're clearly up the creek without a paddle. We need to think about this. We need to keep our options open. We've got this opportunity through Signor Bastianini to kind of get to Mussolini and explore peace feelers. And Churchill goes, you don't understand. Once you open the door, it's blown wide open and you'll never shut it again. There can be no talk of this and all the rest of it. And Halifax threatens to resign. Had Halifax resigned, that would have brought down the government and that would have been it. It would have just been good night, Charlie. But fortunately, he doesn't. Churchill kind of talks him out of it, holds his nerve. And that same night, that same day, Captain Bill Tennant, who is the senior naval officer who's arrived on HMS Wolfhound the previous afternoon on Sunday, has realised that the mole that sticks out of Dunkirk actually can take the weight. And so they realise that actually there's this lifeline, and suddenly they've got a pier, and a pier is 400 times more efficient than lifting people off a beach. And so suddenly they're kind of double stacking, triple stacking these boats along the pier, and people are just kind of, it's just a total conveyor belt. And I think there's something like 24,000 people lifted the next day, 44,000 the next. It gets up to kind of 64,000 by the 30th, something like that, 66,000. And that's how you get to 338,000. It's got nothing to do with the little ships and all the rest of it, as we were discussing the other day. But that's how they get it. And so all these troops do get back, and suddenly it's this massive relief, and suddenly they're kind of, they're able to go, actually we've got lots in our favour and it's all going to be okay if we can just hold off and stave off the invasion. And Churchill makes this very good point. He says Hitler knows he must take Britain or lose the war. And he's absolutely correct. And of course, as we know, Hitler doesn't, and he does lose the war. So, Churchill was absolutely spot on about that. And loads of soldiers that come back from Dunkirk end up fighting throughout the rest of the war. I'm just writing about a guy called Bill Cheel. Bill Cheel was evacuated from Dunkirk. He then went through Tunisia and North Africa. I'm following him now in Sicily. He ends up in Hamburg. He left Britain in, I think, October 1939 to join the BEF. And he finished the war in May 1945 near Hamburg. I mean, unbelievable, with the DLI.
I mean, the thing with Dunkirk is it is absolutely remarkable that the army as an institution is able to say, "Oh well, that didn't go very well, did it?" and shake itself down, and then 4 years, well, not even 4 years later, because men are sent to North Africa that summer, right? Even though, and in fact, it's not just Dunkirk, because there's then 2 years, best part of 2 years of absolutely diabolical reverses and defeats, that the army somehow manages to keep going, as an institution doesn't fall in on itself. I think that's the thing that's really, really interesting about, because arguably after Dunkirk, you could say, well, we're shit at this, aren't we? The Germans are unbeatable. We are really bad at modern war fighting. They wouldn't have called it that then. how on earth do we... And obviously they then go into this sort of paroxysm of how on earth do we defeat what they think is blitzkrieg? What's the answer? Did we have the answers already before the war? And a lot of what they were planning on doing, if ever anyone had bought them the kit, and there's all that going on, that sort of intellectual side of things. And I think that's really interesting, that the army as an institution is able to overcome what is a humiliating
I'd agree with that.
I
But I also think that most people in the BEF recognise that actually the BEF have fought incredibly well. I mean, I've said it before. I'll say it again.
I know.
It
that,
was
James.
the flanks that were pulling
I know
back.
that.
So they have to pull back with them.
But you have Churchill at the same time going, these generals are all gutless. They won't fight. I want generals who'll fight and all this sort of thing. Whereas the army all basically, they're operating within the political confines they've got. And it's the old story that the soldiers are having to deal with the situation the politicians have put them in.
I absolutely agree. But I agree with that. And I also think it is remarkable that you go from kind of ground zero for the United States Army and ground zero for the British Army in, I think you can say June 1940, it's kind of, okay, blank piece of paper, let's start again.
Yeah.
And it is in the US and it is in Britain. And they go, okay, the French were going to do the fighting bit on the ground. We were just going to be, a few tag-alongs. Okay, we're now going to have to shoulder this.
Yeah.
And Britain's thinking it's going to have to shoulder it without, maybe with American material, but not with Americans on the ground. Roosevelt also is going, oh, crikey, okay, the Atlantic's not maybe the kind of big barrier that it once was. We really need to get real with this and kind of build up. 3 years later, they're doing the biggest amphibious invasion the world has ever seen, which, of course, is Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. And it is, when you look at photographs of the port at Bizerta and Alexandria, and you see the amount of material that is being poured onto these landing ships, a vessel that's not even a twinkling in the milkman's eye in 1940. It is absolutely astonishing.
But when you also consider that all of that material has to fit into shipping cycles, so yes. A freighter's round trip to get the bauxite or whatever, that all these things are months long tales. Yes. So it's actually all happened faster even than it appears, because the actual muscle time. Obviously, they're constrained by the seasons, and they're constrained by how long it takes to ship stuff to places. Yeah. It's even more incredible.
It is just absolutely unbelievable. And we were talking about the brilliance of the Americans to construct stuff. I mean, in Tunisia they built 71 airfields.
Yeah.
Right? 71 landing grounds, many of which are all weather, because the weather's really crap in Tunisia in the end of 1942, beginning of 1943, that winter, and so they've got concrete runways. I mean, it's just off the radar. I mean, they suddenly realise they don't have enough capacity on Malta, so the Americans go, not a problem, we'll just build another one. So they go off to Gozo and they literally build one in like 4 days. I mean, it's just. And you've got to get all that stuff to Gozo, which is a kind of sort of rock in the middle of the Mediterranean. I mean, it's not like it's sort of in the middle of America or something. I mean, these are not easy undertakings. It's quite phenomenal. And then you add on to that, what they're doing in the Pacific. I mean, just the resupply of those naval forces. I mean, there's a reason why the Pacific War is a predominantly naval campaign, and that's because most of it happens at sea and on tiny little atolls and little islands and so on. And how do you supply that? And it's the side that is better able to keep supplied that is going to win, and that is always going to be America, because they're absolutely brilliant at it. It just, even in today's world, that would be where you've got computer technology and GPS and all the rest of it. That would be going some, but in the 1940s, it is just so hard to get your head around the brilliance of their logistic arm. It is that supply of war, that operational level, is just out of this world.
Superb. Well, James, that's all we've got time for, I'm afraid. What a way to end. He's all fired up. about
Yeah, I am a bit.
forklifts.
I'm a bit.
Everybody.
Well, it is amazing, isn't it? It is just amazing.
No, it is.
There's no way around
it is absolutely amazing, and you're absolutely right. It's in 3 years that happens. You look at it took us 3 years to not manage to leave the EU. Didn't it?
Yeah,
anyway, thanks for your emails.
Don't.
We'll do more next time, I promise. Keep in touch. Twitter, #WeHaveWays. Email, WeHaveWaysPodcast at gmail.com for all of you in retirement. Cheerio.
Cheerio.